एक दिन ज़हनों में खड़े ये विशाल स्तंभ, अडिग, अजय, पूजनीय, अदम्य, किसी एक सवाल के झोंके से रेत के ढेर की तरह उड़ते नज़र आएँगे। वो जो गए, सो गए, तुम क्या करोगे उस दिन जो केवल हो उनका प्रतिबिंब?
Hello everyone, this is Saraswati and you are watching Shelf Life with Midday. Today we have with us Danish Husain, a poet, actor, storyteller and a very well-known theatre artist. We are here to look at what goes into his shelf and to know more about his personal relationship with books. Could you begin by telling us something about your reading habits? Like how do you manage to be in touch with your books amid a hectic schedule that you follow?
If I look back in my life, I recall that my first reading habits were developed by my mom and an uncle of mine, a mamu of mine. He used to work for Penguins at that time. And a lot of these books would get rejected in printing. There'll be paper torn or a cover torn or, some defect in the book. So what the quality department would do, they would reject those hard copies, and they were not really bad copies. It'll probably just be a one-page torn or something, which is, otherwise it was a perfectly good new book. So he would bring those rejected books, children's literature, and he would gift them to me. And slowly I started building a library of my own. And before I knew, I had a personal library of my own, and it also was in some sense an echo and aspiration, because I had seen everyone else in my house have their own libraries. I always travel with a book. I have learned long back that there is long waiting periods when you're on a shoot. You give a shot, and then for 3 hours you're waiting for the next shot to happen. Before the cell phone came or social media came, I was doing that, sitting in vanity vans and waiting for shots. And I realized the best way to use your time is either read your script, and if you're done with your script, you read a book or two. So I would always carry a book or two with me when I go on shoots, and that way I'm able to, if not read everything that you see here, a lot of them I've read, because I've been able to keep up with this habit of reading books when I'm on shoots.
Have you visited any library or a bookstore in Mumbai, like something that's common?
I would love to. Kitab Khana is one place. When I go to town, I always drop in there and try buying a book or two. They have a lovely setup. You can even sit there and read, and especially when you climb up and that mezzanine kind of a floor that they have, it's very attractive, those alcoves that they have there. The other favorite spot is the Prithvi bookstore, because I'm performing a lot in Prithvi, or I'm going there and I'm watching plays at Prithvi. And Usman, the gentleman who runs the Prithvi bookshop, is a very dear friend. And he also has a very eclectic collection of books.
Danish has been very regular, right? I think since the last 12 years, I guess, since he started doing theatre, especially in Prithvi. And he's a very well-informed reader. He is knowledgeable. So it's not just that, many times he'll come here and he'll pick up books, that titles that we have and he's not aware of, but there are many times that, his suggestions also work very well for us. Because he frequents the place a lot, so he knows the essence of the shop, and he feels, yaar, aap ye bhi rakho. He's very, much interested in emerging Indian writings in English. And that's where, a lot of his orders also come from. And he also picks up many titles in history. So that's an area that we connect also, because I do read a bit of politics and history, and so that's how mainly we do.
Which brings me to this question, is there a specific process you follow when, choosing a book to read?
I think because I am a storyteller, both in the literal sense and also when I'm acting as a character, I'm very attracted by great narratives, great stories. If it's a compelling narrative, I'll read it. It doesn't matter what genre, what subject. It could be about the most mundane thing, like how toothbrush was invented, But if it's told well, I'll be very interested in that story. So it interests me how a writer is putting his or her words in a manner where it is just enough to satisfy your thirst for the narrative and not get saturated by it, or nor feel underwhelmed or thirsty. You feel unquenched. So I think it is really a story being told well. That's what's driving me in terms of picking a book. Also, there are phases. You're reading a historical book, so suddenly your focus is about history right now, so you start gathering books around that source, around that topic that you're reading. Similarly, you're reading, let's say, about biopics, biographies or autobiographies, so you start reading more and more biographies and autobiographies.
So any specific sources that you really rely upon for recommendations, whether it's people in your life or online sources or personalities that you really follow in terms of authors?
Yeah, I mean, when we were young, at that time, social media, internet was really not the way it is right now. It had not exploded. In fact, in India, we didn't even had access to that. We only started having access to internet post mid 95, 96, and that too in a very rudimentary form. So at that time, I remember I was very much influenced by people at my home, what they were reading. But mainly, most of the books that people were reading at my home were essentially Urdu, Farsi, Arabic, Hindi, and we were given very much modern education in English, because everybody thought that English is the way to a better life. So my parents also trusted me there. So most of the choices that I was getting was not really English literature. But I remember in school we would read a lot, and when I went to college, my sister was doing English literature. So she had a very healthy collection of English literature, and through her I started discovering more about English literature and the books that she was reading. Then when I went to college, my subject was economics. And then my friends, and I gave you two of them, Chetan Ghate, who was the director of Institute for Economic Growth and Research now, and Praveen Rana, who was my classmate at college. These two gentlemen had very eclectic tastes, and they, like Chetan Ghate, introduced me to Saul Bellow, one of the greatest American novelists. And when I read him in college, I was like, wow, this is something, this is what literature is. Praveen Rana introduced me to George Attire and Milan Kundera. And again, I was like, this is brilliant, And as you read them, then you start discovering other people. So through Saul Bellow, I'm discovering Philip Roth, and I'm discovering other great American writers. And through Milan Kundera, I'm discovering other great European writers. And I think it's always the case. You open one door and many doors will start opening for you.
Tell us something about the Art of Darstan Go and your earliest engagements with it.
Well, the Art of Darstan Go is essentially the art of telling long romance epics. These are stories that can't be told over one sittings. You have to do multiple sittings to tell a story like that. And Darstan Go, it essentially came about as an art form around one particular story, which is the adventures of Amir Hamza. Amir Hamza used to be the uncle of the Prophet. And then, like King Arthur, his stories kind of tripped into fantasy, into myth-making, into legends, as these stories kind of spread across the world. And these stories came around the Mughal time in India. Akbar was very fascinated by these stories. He commissioned the largest art project in the Mughal history, which is called Hamzanama, where these stories were illustrated on canvases 2.5 by 3 feet, and some 1,400 folios were painted over a period of 15 years with some 300 artists in the atelier. So it was really a mammoth project. And then these stories became almost like a franchisee, where almost anyone with any resources or power or position would have a storyteller, a Darstan Go in their entourage, whose job was only to tell these stories and regale and entertain the employer. And then after that, these stories, when Fort William College opened in 1801, That's when East India Company decided that Dastans are the best way to perhaps orientate and educate the English officers who were coming to India. So these stories were for the first time published in 1802 or 1803 from Fort William College in 4 volumes, The Adventures of Amir Hamza. And then later in 1850s and in 1860s we had other single volumes. And then this was Ghalib Lucknowi, a writer in Calcutta, who was writing that book, whose translation you saw. And then by late 19th century, these stories had become so famous that Naval Kishore, the great publisher in Lucknow, who used to run Naval Kishore Press, he commissioned all the great storytellers in Lucknow at that time, and he said, why don't you write these stories and we will publish them. And that's when the long cycle of Amir Hamza started coming out. With 1883, the first volume came out, and in 1917, the 46th volume came out. And with Mir Baqir Ali's demise, the last great Darstan Go in 1928 in Delhi, this form kind of almost dwindled out. So much so that by the time when we arrived on the scene in 2005-06 to perform these stories, people were completely unaware that a tradition like this ever existed, or these kind of stories ever existed, or such a mammoth enterprise was ever done in this country, where one single narrative over a period of 34 years was published into 46 volumes with multiple authorship, supporting that project. So that is what, in a nutshell, what I would say the history of Darstan Go is.
ये समझिए इतनी किताबें हैं, पिछले 5 सालों में एक समुद्र की, मुंबई में मशहूर है समुद्र की दानिश सर के पास इतनी, अभी उन्होंने शिफ्ट किया था तो मैं आया इत्तेफाकन, तो मैंने देखा सर के पास ड्रेसेस कम, कपड़े कम और किताबें सबसे ज्यादा हैं। अगर सारी किताबें एक जगह इकट्ठा कर दी जाए तो मेरे ख्याल से ये कमरा पूरा भर जाए। इसलिए ये भी सर ने, मैं समझा सर की जिंदगी जो बचपन से अब तक की किताबें होगी, तो सर ने मुझे बताया नहीं बेटा ये सिर्फ 5 साल की किताब है, बाकी किताबें सारी दिल्ली में। तो सर से मैं इतना इंस्पायर हो गया, मैंने कहा सर मैं भी पढ़ना चाहता हूँ, तो फिर पढ़ो, तुम्हारे पास इतनी बुक्स नहीं है, मैं आपका ऐसे बोरो करके जाना चाहता हूँ। अभी मंटो में मैं कुछ काम कर रहा हूँ, तो फिर ये सर का जो दस्तावेज मंटो का 5 वॉल्यूम है, 5 बुक्स का, तो मैं ले जाता हूँ एक एक करके, और 1 महीने में एक पढ़ पाता हूँ। इतना मुश्किल है ये, 1 महीने में एक पढ़ पाता हूँ, तो ये मैं 2 पढ़ पाया।
So what are you reading currently?
Currently, I'm reading a book called The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow, anthropologist and historian, who basically are looking at history from an alternative point of view. The other book I'm reading is Josie Joseph's, basically how the Indian establishment, the government, how institutions within the country have subverted the very democratic paradigm that we had. And I'm also reading Red Samadhi by Gitanjali Shri, the one who won the International Booker's Prize. So I'm reading the Hindi one. I still have to pick Daisy's international English translation. But so these are the 3 books that I'm reading right now.
Tell us something about how literature or your reading habits have shaped your art and creativity.
It's a very big question. There are lots of answers to that. One of the things is that when you read a good book, when you read a good author, when you run into a good orator, when you run into a good thinker, one of the first things which dawns on you when you hear them out is that I always thought like this, but this person articulates it better, says it better.
Yes.
That's what all great thinkers, great writers, great storytellers, that's what they do. They articulate it better. They suddenly give you an insight which was possibly there. It was in plain sight, but you never saw it. They suddenly tell you this crack in the wall.
Yeah.
And what is lying beyond the wall, and you can see beyond the wall. They are able to see what is underneath the surface. They can tell you what the template is. They can tell you, okay, this is what you're watching, but the great design is this behind this. And suddenly, the moment you realize that, the world opens for you. So I think this is what happens when you read good writers, good authors, good storytellers, that they open the world for you. suddenly you see a lot more than what you can literally see. And the same thing was happening with me when I was reading these great writers and great authors, that it made me see beyond what was shown to me.
Which are those, some of those books which have really impacted you in that manner?
A lot of them. I mean, I remember when I read The Joke by Milan Kundera as a 19-year-old boy, when I read Herzog, Saul Bellows' novel, as a 22-year-old boy. I remember A Bend in the River by V.S. Naipaul, the novel. I remember The Age of Uncertainty when I read by John Kenneth Galbraith, the great economist. Almost everything by Ghalib and by Faz and by Momin and by Mir and by Mir Anis, Vikram Seth, when we were discovering him, Amitav Ghosh, we were discovering him, Arundhati Roy when we were discovering her. Hindi literature, Premchand, Shrilal Shukla, Nirmal Verma, when all these people I was discovering in my 90s, Ismat Choktai, Qurratul Lan, Heather, I would say multiple authorship that was affecting, that was influencing me and pushing me to read more books.
Subscribe to Midday India. Get direct notifications on all our videos by clicking on the bell icon.